privileged, that's a word we use sometimes, we mean it, at MardiGrass this year to have Ethan Nadelmann to speak to us. Ethan is the, probably well known to most of you really, but he's been around drug policy debates for the United States for as long as anyone can remember. You'll know his name, you'll know some of his work, you'll know a lot of his work. First involved, I think, in drug policy in the United States in about 1990 something, maybe a bit before. Anyway, huge figure in the national drug scene, drug policy scene. The director for many years of and founder of the drug, what was it called? The Drug Policy Alliance? Drug Policy Alliance. Which was the prominent figure in the United States and internationally, really, about driving the arguments for change, driving the reforms, having the campaigns, having some successes in the United States in terms of winding back prohibition. So, yes, enormously privileged, as I say, and pleased to have Ethan Nadelmann with us today. He's going to speak to us about the paradox of the United States being the prime driver of prohibition and the war on drugs, and yet at the same time, oddly enough, at the forefront of law reform around cannabis. So thank you, Ethan.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Yeah, so I will go into really some thinking about and describing of the history of what's gone on in the U.S. around this issue. But I called the talk the American Paradox for this reason. The paradox I'm referring to, as you just said, is how does one explain the fact that my country and my government, the United States government, which was the leading proselytizer, the leading promoter, the leading enforcer of the global war on drugs since roughly the second decade of the 20th century for almost 100 years, nonetheless became the global leader on legalizing and legally regulating cannabis, first medicinally and then more broadly. Because that is one hell of a paradox, right? And what the quick answer to that is that I think the key explanation was our strategy on medical marijuana beginning in 1996. That's what transformed things. And let me explain this. So I think all of you are aware, cannabis has a history going back thousands of years. Archaeologists find evidence, et cetera, around the world of people using cannabis for whatever reasons, including in childbirth and what have you. You know it was part of the pharmacopoeia in the United States. It was legal until 1937, right? Pharmacists and others could provide it, so prescribe it. You had the reasons for cannabis prohibition in the first place were a bit, there's a debate about that. Some of that we know was associated with discrimination and fears around Mexican Americans and Mexican migrants in the early part of the 20th century. But we also know that was not the only reason, that some of the northeastern states which criminalized it, so for other reasons. Some was the association with hashish and other sorts of fears around this sort of stuff. A lot of the prohibitions began first at the municipal level, in El Paso, Texas, in the early part of the 20th century, and then they became prohibitions at the state level in the early teens and early 20s. Interestingly, people sometimes blame Harry Anslinger, the notorious founder of our Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930, as being the leading figure. But in fact, he initially was not so keen on jumping on cannabis. He was all about heroin until he saw the political value of jumping on the marijuana issue. And then he did, in fact, become the leading promoter of including cannabis in the global drug prohibition regimes, in American laws and federal law. Leading up to 1937, the Federal Tax Act, which essentially made everything illegal, including the growing of hemp. And then World War II came along, and we had problems accessing certain materials from East Asia during the war. And so there was a period where all of a sudden there was a re-legalization of hemp during the war to help the war effort, and then it was recriminalized thereafter. So we had this period of cannabis as, prohibited throughout the United States, prohibited medicinally and otherwise. There was a doctor named Todd Mikaria who produced a book called, I think, The Medical Marijuana Papers, and he was one of the early proselytizers in this area. And then what happened in the late 70s, early 80s, was a fellow named Bob Randall, who was an amazing advocate, and he suffered from glaucoma. And even though cannabis is actually not the best drug for cannabis for most people, he won the right in federal court to consume cannabis for its medical value. And remarkably, at that point, he began to receive a monthly canister of marijuana joints from the federal farm where they grew marijuana in Mississippi, associated with the University of Mississippi. And in his footsteps, others followed, including a stockbroker named Irvin Rosenfeld, who had some strange disease that I can't pronounce, but who also, was able to continue being a stockbroker while he smoked, 14 joints a day. I one time asked you, don't you get high? He said, first of all, not from the stuff that the government sends me, which was not the best quality, but it's also you develop a tolerance if you're using the same type of cannabis all the time. And he said, sometimes I'll get high if somebody offers me a joint of something new I haven't tried, but basically showed that he could keep functioning. And others followed in those footsteps. And you had a few dozen people getting their legal canisters from the federal government. And then what happened in the late or 80s was a whole raft of states, in part because of the efforts of NORML, in part because of the efforts of Bob Randall and his wife Alice O'Leary. They passed these little miniature medical marijuana laws in the 80s. A lot of people don't even know this history. And in fact, about a half a dozen of the states, and some of these laws were named after state legislators who had gotten cancer and used it for that, or their kids, or somebody else who was a patient, the Lynn Pearson Act in New Mexico, other ones like that, I can't remember the name, in New York. But in fact, 30-something states passed these little medical marijuana research laws. A handful actually began, providing marijuana to a small number of patients. There were a few research studies. And then because of, I have a little cough, so once in a while I'm going to stop and take a little water or a cough drop.
Go right ahead. We're very liberal at MardiGrass. If you need to have a drink, you can have a drink. It's fine. Take your time.
Yeah. And the weed I smoked last night, even though it was really good.
Nothing to do with it, Ethan. Nothing to do with
that. So to continue. But that was more or less, as the war on drugs heated up during the 1980s, Ronald Reagan and then George Bush, but quite frankly, it was very much of a bipartisan effort. The kind of federal war on drugs, to some extent, the orchestrator of it, beginning in the early 1980s, was the number 3 guy in the Justice Department, a guy named Rudy Giuliani, who some of you have heard of, because he then went on to be the chief federal prosecutor in New York, and then our mayor, and somehow became America's mayor, despite, or maybe because he was one of the most despicable Americans to set foot in late 20th, early 21st century American politics. But basically, marijuana sort of got swept up in the broader war and the broader hysteria that was focused around crack cocaine. And that history of the medical marijuana state laws, where a few hundred people maybe had gotten access, was sort of forgotten. Then in California in the early 90s, a fellow named Dennis Perrone was a local AIDS activist and local marijuana dealer. And he and others got behind a local resolution that had no real legal force, but because laws, in the United States, you have federal laws and state laws, and the municipalities can kind of issue directives about how local police should do things, but they can't really change state or federal law. But they passed a little something there. And then in 1995, Dennis and some colleagues drafted a little medical marijuana legalization law, like 2 pages, very short, and started collecting signatures to try to put on the ballot. Because some of you may know, in the United States, in our 50 states, roughly half the states allow a law to be changed or passed, not just through the legislature, but also through what we call a ballot initiative, where you go out and collect signatures, get enough signatures, get the thing certified, get it put on the ballot, so at the same time in November when people are voting for governor or senator or congressman or assemblyman or whatever, they're also voting on different ballot measures. So half the states allow this, mostly in the West, because it was associated with the popular democracy movement 100 years ago. And he's trying to collect the signatures. But in point of fact, in California, although a few ballot measures made the ballot with volunteer signatures in the 80s, it basically became impossible thereafter. I mean, you needed 500,000 signatures or more. It almost always required raising enough money so that you could, pay people to help collect signatures, whether they were already part of the cause or not. And so this thing wasn't really going anywhere. And meanwhile, I had been a professor teaching at Princeton. I had sort of popped out with some articles that had got a lot of acclaim and would become known as kind of the leading advocate of drug legalization or leading critic of the drug war. I then, in 1992, got in a phone call out of the blue from a person who was not quite as well known back then, a financier and philanthropist named George Soros. And he'd invited me to lunch, and we'd hit it off, and I landed up leaving the university and creating a little organization, first called the Lindesmith Center, named after Alfred Lindesmith, the first prominent American academic to challenge conventional thinking about drugs, addiction, and drug policy. Eventually, this became the Drug Policy Alliance in 2000. And I was getting going as an activist, focusing on, tomorrow, I'm going to give a talk about things other than marijuana. I'm going to talk about the issues of tobacco, nicotine, and psychedelics, and opioids, and the range of other drug issues, because the cannabis issue is only ever about 1/3 of my work and my organization's work, but it was the one that got most of the headlines, and the ones where our success was the most dramatic as opposed to the other areas. So hopefully come back tomorrow and hear about the rest of the effort to end the war on drugs in the United States and around the world. And what happened was I'd had the good fortune to meet some political consultants and experts. I'd also had the good fortune to meet not just George Soros, who was already a billionaire, but also some other wealthy guys. A guy named George Zimmer, who created a company called the Men's Wearhouse, which is the largest men's clothing retail company in American history, and a guy named Peter Lewis, who was the head of something called Progressive Insurance, the second biggest auto insurance company in the country, and a guy named John Sperling, who had created something called the University of Phoenix, a for-profit university. He had been kind of lefty union organizing professor who created this thing. And I had the good fortune to meet each of them under different circumstances. And I knew that George Zimmer and Peter Lewis, not only, all those guys, Soros, Sperling, they'd all smoked weed in the past, but for Soros, it wasn't particularly of interest to him, the personal use of it. Sperling, the same thing. But for Peter Lewis and George Zimmer, it was personal. In fact, I think for George Zimmer, it was somebody who had probably had a problem with alcohol and cocaine and smoking weed on a daily basis, including all day long at the office, was what enabled him to stay off the alcohol and the cocaine and build a multi-billion-dollar business. And for Peter Lewis, it was also kind of medical in his case. And so it was very personal for them. But the advantage was that Soros had the balls to lead. George ultimately didn't really care so much what other people thought, in a way. He was willing to lead, and the other guys didn't really want to lead, they wanted to follow. And so I knew those guys, and I knew that initially Dennis Perone, the local activist, was just about, we want to do this volunteer effort, and finally he said, look, we need some help. Hey, we need like $25,000, $50,000. Well, I called the political consultant. He said, Ethan, that's bullshit. You want to win an initiative in California back then? This was 1996, 30 years ago. It's going to cost you a minimum of $2 million, not $50,000, right? But I was able to put together a deal involving George Soros, George Zimmer, and Peter Lewis, each kicking in $500,000. Then we got other people to kick in, including Lawrence Rockefeller, the son of the famous John D. Rockefeller. Him coming in. We were able to raise the money, and we also, I always felt a little regretful about this, but not too much. Dennis, the activist, who, if he hadn't gotten started, we wouldn't have looked to get involved in it. Dennis had a lot of ego as well, and he hated the fact that even though we might come in and win this thing, that he wasn't going to be heading it. But the big money guys were not going to give money for a ballot initiative headed by a local ex-marijuana dealer, activist, And so we, to some extent, took the campaign away from Dennis. Thank you, Dennis. You got it going. You'll always get the credit, but to win this thing and make it professional, that's what we're going to do. And so I oversaw a campaign, coordinating the funders, and we made sure that the state spokespeople were not Dennis, the former marijuana dealer, AIDS activist out of San Francisco, but we got nurses and doctors and women who had dealt with, chemotherapy and breast cancer and using those things. We changed the face of marijuana in this campaign. And when we won that campaign in November 1996, it won with 56% of the vote in California. It got more votes than Bill Clinton did in his overwhelming victory, re-election victory in California. So it was a major victory. It was the first time that the nascent drug policy reform movement in America showed that we could play ball in the big leagues of American politics and win. And I got to tell you, it shook up things. That Christmas, That Christmas, you had the drug czar, a former General Barry McCaffrey. You had the top Clinton officials, Donna Shalala, the head of Health and Human Services, the head of National Drug Abuse. They get up right around Christmas of '96, and they say, well, we're going to tell you something. This is bullshit. Soros and Nadelmann, they just want to give drugs to everybody, including your kids. This is not about medical value or anything like that. And in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to go after any doctor who recommends it or any patient who takes it. Well, at that point, I just hired a very smart young lawyer. There was another one. And they said, you know what? Let's sue the federal government for violating the First Amendment rights of patients and doctors to talk about the medical value of marijuana. And we sued the federal government in the lower federal court, then we won it in the middle court, the appeals court, and eventually the Supreme Court decided not to hear it, and we won that case. The best contribution donation I ever got to my organization was a check for $325,000 to paid for by the U.S. federal government's drug czar's office, reimbursing us for our attorney's fees. All right? I mean, that was a beautiful one. Now, the other thing, it became the cover story of Newsweek. I mean, people saw that something was changing. Now, we were working on other issues like needle exchange to reduce HIV/AIDS and access to fentanyl, the stigma on methadone maintenance, and trying to talk about the racism of the war on drugs and all that. But medical marijuana was the true breakthrough here, right? Now, if you ask, what happened? Well, we had to show we could do it over again. So in fact, what we then went is we went back and we did the research on the other 24 states where you could do a ballot initiative. We looked at public opinion polling on medical marijuana in a whole bunch of those. And we then identified a half a dozen states, Alaska, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Nevada, and Maine. In each of those 6 states, they weren't huge populations, so we could afford to collect the signatures, right? They also were ones where at least 55% of the public agreed that marijuana should be legal with a doctor's permission. And we went back to those states in '98 and '99 and 2000, and we won all 6 of those through the ballot initiative process. And then Hawaii became the first state to legalize medical marijuana through the state legislative process as opposed to a voter referendum initiative process. Now, what I'm going to say is that medical marijuana strategy, it was transformative. What did it do? First of all, as I said, it showed that this nascent drug policy reform movement could actually win. You know, when most Americans were still more or less supporting this very harsh war on drugs, here was an exception of something that they would actually get behind. It turned out that already some significant percentage of Americans, 20% back then, maybe 30%, said they knew somebody who used marijuana medically. Right? But the other thing that happened was we transformed the imagery. It used to be that, you know, beginning in the late 80s when I and others, you know, I was a professor at Princeton, you know, there was a mayor of Baltimore, there were some former police chiefs, and, you know, we were speaking out. There were famous conservatives like William Buckley and the economist Milton Friedman, all calling for some degree of legalization, decriminalization. But if you had a major media article about legalization, what would they do? They wouldn't show our pretty faces wearing, you know, ties and suits. What they would do is show some, you know, 17-year-old, high school dropout with hemp leaves in his blonde dreadlocks as the picture of cannabis and big smokes and all this sort of stuff. That was not what was going to move American public opinion, that imagery. When we shifted the imagery to the woman suffering from, you know, breast cancer, going through chemotherapy and using this, shifted it to the young person dealing with AIDS wasting syndrome who needed this for their appetite, shifted it to the person with multiple sclerosis using it for the tremors, shifted it to those people, shifted it to doctors talking about its medical value, shifted it to nurses who were talking about the patients they were seeing with their own eyes. Well, that changed something. And the other thing that was really interesting and that we could never measure it to show how effective it was, and I didn't anticipate this, the news media became fairly favorable, but really important was the entertainment media. Because in the periods after that California initiative in '96 and the other ones, the entertainment media, the TV shows, both the comedies and the dramas, one after another, would include an episode about medical marijuana, either for tears or for laughs. There was a famous show called Murphy Brown, right, where, you know, she gets breast cancer and has to smoke marijuana. A host of other programs that were doing this sort of thing. In the movies, I remember a movie with Walter Matthau. I remember Susan Sarandon, the movie actress, stopped doing any movie unless she could smoke marijuana in it. Whether it was Thelma and Louise and blowing marijuana into the trunk through that hole at the police officer they locked in the trunk, or whether it was doing a movie called Stepmom where, she's got a kid going off to, or whether, she's one where she actually plays somebody uses marijuana medically. So you began to see that transformation in the public imagery of this. I remember getting to know people in Latin America, and I meet some of the big media people at Univision, other major media outlets, and I said, you want to change things in Latin America? The thing to do, the telenovelas, these famous kind of long soap operas in Latin America, write up an episode and have the beloved abuela, the beloved grandmother, right? Have her get cancer, get whatever, and have her, her granddaughter or grandson says, grandma, abuela, you have to smoke. No, it's illegal. I'm Catholic. It's God forbid. No. And finally, the doctor is saying you should do it. And finally, let the episode close with the abuela having the puff, and all of a sudden she relaxes. Right? That imagery, that transformation of who was doing this. The other thing that began to happen was we began to have these dispensaries, started by activists, cannabis dispensaries popping up, not unlike what had happened in the Netherlands. Remember Netherlands back in 1976? They decriminalized the possession of cannabis, and they cracked down tougher on the white powder drugs. And after a little while, you begin to have the cannabis, the coffee shops in the Netherlands. Some of you old enough remember that. They still exist, actually. And initially, the cops shut them down, and then maybe the cops say, maybe we shouldn't shut them down, and actually this way it's above ground, we can regulate it, and then the political authorities begin to get behind it a bit. And you saw this system eventually bubble up where you had a not fully legal but quasi-legal regulated system of these coffee shops emerging. And something very similar to that happened with the medical cannabis dispensaries, especially in California, but increasingly in some other states. Now, what's significant about that is they oftentimes were careful to be discreet. They didn't put big cannabis leaves in the windows. People knew they were there. There was a little cannabis leaf. They oftentimes met with the local police or prosecutors and say, look, what's the guidelines here? What's the rules by which we can work with one another? So people began to become aware of cannabis dispensaries popping up, and the sky didn't fall. It all seemed okay. You didn't have teenagers flocking all around to get it from the medical marijuana patients. You had doctors, growing numbers of them, beginning to say, this actually helps a lot of our patients, right? We're seeing it, and we actually are recommending it. And although we cannot write a formal, legal, federal prescription form, we will write a letter. We will write on their medical form that this is okay. We transformed the imagery of cannabis. Right? Some years later, when we were moving into the legalization phase, beginning in 2010, 2012, 2014, we did a public opinion poll. And we were trying to figure out who might vote to legalize marijuana, right? And we knew we weren't going to win this, right? I mean, for me and most of the other leaders of this movement, this was first and foremost an issue around personal freedom and sovereignty of our own minds and bodies. And who the fuck is the government to tell me what I can or cannot put in my body so long as I don't hurt another soul? But that argument about sovereignty and freedom and personal freedom did not move anybody in the center of the American political spectrum, which was the group that we needed to win. We needed to speak to them. Right? When we started, we had 25% of the American public saying marijuana should be legal, and maybe 50% saying it should be legal for medical. And now it's up to, 90% saying legal for medical, and 65% saying legal overall. We had to speak to the center. We had to use the right language, the right messengers, all of that. So around 2013 or so, we did the survey. We were trying to predict who would support it. And so among three of the questions we asked is, how recently have you consumed cannabis? And as you can imagine, the more recently you would use cannabis, the more likely you were to say, yes, I'll support legalizing. Then we asked the second question. Do you know anybody who uses cannabis? And interestingly, saying yes to that did not predict supporting the legalization of cannabis. Why, I think? Because if you're in this world, of course you know people who legalize, but you already support legalizing it, and we're only a minority of the country. But if you're not in the cannabis consuming world, or maybe you did it when you were in high school or college but haven't done it in decades, the people you tend to know who use cannabis are not your friends, because if you don't smoke, your friends who do smoke may not be telling you about it back in that time. The people you know are going to be your friends or your cousins, whatever kid, who's a fuck up, who's smoking too much weed and screwing up in school. And therefore, your imagery of who is a marijuana user was going to be a negative imagery, because it would be the people who you knew used marijuana were the people screwing up on it. Whereas the people using it and getting straight A's and going to good colleges, or the people who were, doing, your boss maybe smoking, he wasn't going to talk about it, right? It was those. Then we asked the question, do you know anybody who you believe uses marijuana for medical purposes? It turned out that saying, yes, I do know somebody who uses marijuana for medical purposes, that turned out to be as good a predictor of supporting broader all-adult use legalization as having used marijuana in the last year or so. There was something about knowing somebody who used marijuana medically that opened up people to saying, you know what? If grandma and grandpa and auntie and whatever can use it, if they can use it for sleep or anxiety, if they can use it instead of booze or opioids, if they can do it for this or for that, then how bad can it really be? And if we already have these dispensaries that are kind of quasi-legally regulated, and the sky's not falling, it was that created a level of comfort, right? So that strategy we used in the US was really, really pivotal. It also helped, by the way, that adolescent use, one of the things I began to realize about the evidence there was that adolescent use of cannabis or any other drug tends to go up and down irrespective of what the drug laws are regarding adults. So it turns out, and if you look comparatively across different countries, it turns out you can see high levels of use among adults or among kids or vice versa, but that in fact levels of use among kids and to some extent adults goes up or down regardless of what the drug laws are. It's much more influenced by fad and fashion and culture and all of these sorts of things, right? It's not about how harsh or how lenient the drug laws are. And I have to say, we got lucky in some respects. Because when we had that wave of beginning to legalize medical marijuana beginning in '96 and the following years and through the initiative process and the legislative process, adolescent use did not jump. It stayed fairly constant. And jumping forward to the broader legalization of marijuana beginning in 2012, actually adolescent use has remained stable or even gone down throughout much of the country, while the use among people my age has quadrupled, and the use among other adult groups has also increased quite substantially, but adolescence has not necessarily gone up. Right? So we got lucky because it could have gone up irrespective of the changes of the laws. In fact, it stayed stable, and that was a very valuable, happenstance variable that happened there. So there were other issues that popped up. Some of the things you have to keep in mind is that not every battle is direct. So to give you two examples, there was a court case happening in Oregon involving the right to die that also involved about doctors and patients and personal freedom. If the Supreme Court had ruled the wrong way on that law, that might well have shot down our success on medical marijuana. You don't think about those things coming in from the sidelines about that. But in fact, it played an important role at that time, right? The other variable on this thing, well, the international piece. As we broke through on medical marijuana, there were two important moments. One was quite personal. The other one was a broader global effect. As you know, the international drug conventions don't really allow the adult legal sale, the way we now do it in half the states in America. Remember, right now in America, to jump forward, the total cannabis THC global market in the United States is now estimated at roughly $100 billion a year. Now, of that, roughly 30, how will you break it out? About 40 to 50% of that remains illegal, entirely illegal. Another 35% or so is now the legally regulated market, and then another 15, 20% is what's called the THC. Some of you may be aware in America, we now have all these THC beverages, THC gummies, THC everything, a loophole in what was called our Farm Bill that allowed you to take the hemp, which had 0.3% or lower THC, and turn it into a very high potency stuff. So we have this crazy world in America right now with these three different markets which overlap and interplay with one another, but just the legally regulated market, which exists in half the states right now, right, totals probably $30 to $40 billion a year, is producing $4 to $5 billion a year of tax revenue for state and local governments, is producing 400,000 to 500,000 legal tax-paying jobs, right? I mean, we're talking about a serious industry that has emerged in the United States. But all of it is still technically in violation, not just of federal law, although that was beginning to change as of last week, but also of the international drug conventions, which fortunately have no enforcement mechanisms attached to them, but they are quite influential. And I know even in Australia, most, especially smaller countries, and even more so in the developing world, pay a lot of attention to what the International Anti-Drug Conventions say and what the International Narcotics Control Board says and all this sort of thing. But there were two moments, one personal. You know, fortunately for me, I was able to develop a very positive relationship with George Soros. And it resulted in, over the last 30 years, him contributing hundreds of millions of dollars to drug policy reform and harm reduction all around the world, right? Not just cannabis reform, which was not his big passion, but harm reduction, global stuff. I mean, really remarkable. But I also was, as I said before, able to meet a number of wealthy men and from across the political spectrum. You know, Soros became more and more identified once George Bush became president with the kind of left liberal part of American politics. But some of my biggest backers were people on the far right who agree with Soros on almost nothing, but who thought that was crazy what the government was doing with respect to the war on drugs. Well, there was a moment that happened in late 2011 when I went to see George, and I hit him up a whole bunch of issues, and then I said, George, I need $1.5 million because it looks like there's going to be ballot initiatives in California, in Colorado and Washington in 2012 to legalize cannabis. And we're not leading on these ones, we're helping, but it would help a lot. And he said, okay. And then I made the mistake of not doing a follow-up memo right away. One of the things you learn is do the right-away follow-up memo just to get it down there. I screwed up. I called him a month later and said, okay, George, I need that $1.5 million now. He goes, Ethan, I said I'd think about it. I didn't say I'd do it. I said, actually, George, you did firmly say. No, Ethan, I did not. I said I'd think about it. George, you did make a commitment. George, no, I didn't. Slams the phone down on me. Only time he ever hung up me, freaked me out, bummed me out. A few days later, he called me back on some other matter. Maybe it was just to say no hard feelings. I don't know. But anyway, I was bummed. I didn't have the money to help out on Colorado and Washington, where we were helped in the drafting and some of the, other sorts of stuff. And then in early 2012, some stuff started to bubble up in Latin America. This goes to the other drug issues. But all of a sudden, there was a right-wing former military general in Guatemala, Otto Perez Molina, who all of a sudden popped out saying, maybe we need to think about legalizing drugs. And actually, I met with him 4 years before and maybe planted the seed. And I was planning to go visit the country, and it turned out he was following my whereabouts. And I landed up all of a sudden at the presidential palace one weekend with him and the vice president, who turned out he was having an affair with, but a whole bunch of others, making the case about, And then, right before that, I happened to get a meeting with President Calderon in Mexico, who was leading the Mexican drug war, which was a total disaster, but he also was a bit of a disciple of Milton Friedman. And it was clear that, and I said to him, listen, when you were going around the United States last year saying that if we can't really get this drug war working, we may have to consider other alternatives, did you mean when you said other alternatives by legalization? And he said, yeah, that is what I meant. Because in the back of his mind, that wasn't going to solve his problem with the narco gangs and all that, but he understood enough as an economist that ultimately legalization was the answer. And meanwhile, the president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, I knew to be sympathetic as well. So this stuff's bubbling up in Latin America, right? And the question they're all asking me is, what's going to happen in Colorado and Washington? Are you actually going to legalize? Because there'd been an initiative in California in 2010 that had gotten close but lost. And I said, I don't know. So I go back and I go see George. And I'm telling him how excited I am about, what's going on in Mexico and Guatemala. And he says, well, do you think that's going to influence how Americans are thinking about this? I said, George, are you crazy? Americans don't give a damn what happens in the rest of the world. They care what happens in Guatemala, Mexico? No. What's important is that the president's there. Everybody down there wants to know what's going to happen in the United States on legalizing marijuana. And he says, okay, I'll give you $1.5 million. And it was that rebound from the international side to this that led to that $1.5 million. So we go, and actually we win. Colorado and Washington both get about 55% of the vote. Major breakthrough. Now, both of these things happened in violation of federal law. And President Obama, you know, back when he was running for president in 2007 and 2008, he had made 3 commitments. One was, I'll get the Justice Department to back off a bit on medical marijuana. I'll get rid of these very harsh mandatory minimum drug sentences on crack cocaine, which are racially biased, and I'll allow some money movement forward on needle exchange. And in the beginning of his term in 2009, he actually made good on those 3 commitments. And then he basically put out the word saying, I'm not doing anything more in drug policy reform unless I get reelected. And then 2012, when Colorado and Washington win, he wins re-election. And we're wondering, what's he going to do? And he begins to step out on the racism of the broader war on drugs. But they're hemming and hawing. What are we going to do about Colorado and Washington, which clearly violates federal law? And what happens, it took them 9 months, and finally the Attorney General, Eric Holder, and Obama basically say, they put out a memo, the Justice Department memo, that basically says, you know what? If Colorado and Washington can effectively demonstrate that legally regulating cannabis will better advance the public health and public safety objectives of federal drug control, in particular our 1970 Controlled Substances Act, then who are we to object? If Colorado and Washington show they can regulate this without an uptick in youth use, without increasing crime, without much, you know, selling to other states, then we don't need to come in on this. That was extraordinary. For the United States of America, the federal government to say we are going to tolerate the legal over-the-counter sale of state-regulated marijuana was massive. The proselytized a leading global war on drugs. And then, in October of 2014, we had Oregon and Alaska and Washington, D.C. on the ballot for legalization. D.C. was only quasi-legalization. And the Assistant Secretary of State for Narcotics, William Brownfield, who had been a kind of tough war on drugs guy, but a very respected diplomat, been the ambassador to Colombia and Venezuela before, he issues what becomes known as the Brownfield Doctrine with 4 pillars. 2 of them are what you would expect. Respect the conventions, crack down on transnational crime. But the other 2 said, we are now, after having advocated for a rigid interpretation of the international conventions for the last century, we are now going to support a flexible interpretation. And whereas before we demanded that everybody around the world be just like us, we are now going to show a tolerance for a diversity of approaches in drug policy. In fact, the president of Uruguay had come to the White House and maybe met with the Vice President Biden and more or less said, if you legalize cannabis, we're not going to create a problem as long as you don't start talking about legalizing other drugs or exporting it to the United States or what have you. What we did in California with the legalization of medical marijuana in '96 and then backing it up in other states in the following years, that opened up the pathway to other areas, right, to broadening the marijuana policy and changing public opinion. It got public opinion to shift and to ease up. Other governments began to pay attention. That fact of the matter is that thing in 1996 opened up the point in 2014 for a transformation for the first time in a century of U.S. global drug policy. It was the moment at which the United States handed off the baton as leading global drug warrior to the overeager Russians who wanted to rush forward with now being the global leader of the punitive war on drugs, right? And to some extent, we have not reclaimed, I'm happy to say, our role as the global proselytizer of the war on drugs. The United States did not object when finally the UN embraced harm reduction as part and parcel. They did not object when they began to move in the right direction of cannabis reform. Right? So understand, it was that sort of unpredictable evolution. There was also another key moment, the racial justice element of cannabis reform. Right? You know, it was obvious. I mean, people used to think that everybody getting busted for marijuana were like, hippies and college kids. And then it began to dawn on people that it was overwhelmingly young men of color, especially young black men. But it still was not a major issue. And then around 2008, 9, 10, a friend of mine, Harry Levine, wrote a major report pointing out that, in fact, it was overwhelmingly young men of color, young black men in New York City and elsewhere. Then the American Civil Rights Union put out a report on this sort of stuff. They talked about the racial injustice of the war on drugs. And when Obama finally says, you know what? I think I'm okay with legalization. He cited the arguments that my friend Harry Levine had made before about this being first and foremost a racial justice issue. But in point of fact, I don't think the country would have been open to accepting the racial justice arguments in the first place, but for the fact that we had softened up public opinion on marijuana with the medical issue in the first place. It was that transformation of the imagery. I have to say this too, like I love being in Nimbin right now. I love the celebration of cannabis. But quite frankly, the celebration of cannabis is not what got us legalization. There were moments when we were working on a medical marijuana law in New Mexico, and some of the legalized cannabis folks would stand up on the steps of the legislature as we were negotiating inside to get a medical marijuana bill through, and all of a sudden our bill was dead because of people standing up, smoking joints, not talking medical, being out over the top on this sort of stuff. It was the type of thing where it's a weird thing because here I am, marijuana's been my good friend for 50 years, right? I love weed. I've had to be careful as I was a public figure doing it, but the fact of the matter was the public display. It's oftentimes when I go to the annual NORML conferences, and I would give these kind of inspirational speeches about what it means to build a movement. But one of the things I'd say is, when it comes to advocacy is not simply about just opening your mouth and saying what you think. Advocacy is about using the right language in order to persuade people, to move people. Advocacy is the language you use to get mom and dad and grandpa and grandma and somebody else to kind of soften up their resistance to legalizing marijuana and to go along with it. It's about appealing to their hearts, about appealing to their minds. Some people will take the cost benefit. Some people focus on the tax revenue. Some people will point out the futility of it. Some people focus on the medical piece, whatever it might be. But if in fact the thing that was going to move the middle voter, the soccer mom, middle-class white American voter who maybe smoked a little weed in high school or college and hasn't done it in 20 years and is hearing the government saying all this weed is super potent right now and it's going to screw up with your kids and the developing brain and all the blah, 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 blah. And what I say to them, if what's going to move them is for me to go, and that's going to be, those are the words that move somebody in the center, those are the words I'm going to use. I'm going to use whatever language I believe to be basically honest, true, but what is going to move the center. That's what it takes. That's what it takes. Now, I see you going like this. It takes money. Interesting. What? Loving. Lobbying. But you see, this is an interesting thing. Well, but what I'll say is that, so it's oftentimes, and one of the things that drives me crazy is that now, once we move towards legalization, right? With Colorado and Washington 2012, Oregon and Alaska 2014, and then in 2016, California, the big one, right? And Nevada, Massachusetts, and Maine with only Arizona, right? At that point, I figure we have won, and that's the point at which I retired, right? I mean, it's like, we've done it. You know how much of a role the marijuana industry played in funding all of the work to legalize for lobbying and ballot initiatives between the beginning of 1996 and 2016? Close to zero. The other organization besides my organization, Drug Policy Alliance, Marijuana Policy Project, they were raising a little more money in the industry in the last few years, a little more, play to pay. Okay, give me $100,000, we'll write a provision to help you. But I was, ethical about this stuff. I did not raise any money from industry until we had already drafted our ballot initiatives. They were not going to buy a single provision there. It wasn't until I went to a fundraising thing in Oregon in 2014 where I even saw people showing up from industry, and they were little guys in a few labor unions. So the marijuana industry played almost no role in getting us to where we got in 2016. To the extent they were lobbying, it was mostly to get themselves special preferences for their industry preferences. It wasn't that sort of stuff. Once we won in 2016, the philanthropists like the George Soroses and the other folks, they said, at this point, let the industry pay for it. We're going to move on to other issues we care about and the other aspects of the war on drugs. But money did not play that role. Money to help us get those initiatives on the ballot from people who were involved in this, not because they wanted to make money in the industry, but because they cared about this passionately. So now I'm just going to make some final observations here. Australia, every country's different, right? When Uruguay did it in 2013, right after Colorado and Washington, it was a hyper-control we brought the Uruguayans up to see Colorado, and they said, we can't do that in Uruguay. And then they told the Americans what they were doing in Uruguay, and the Americans said, we can't do that in America. Just a fundamentally different culture. When Canada went through with a national model, which has been quite good, but it's just different. Now you see in the Netherlands and in Switzerland this kind of pilot projects and this trial, and bit by bit they are actually moving towards legalization. Czech Republic may go there. Malta sort of went there, and they keep tripping over their own shoelaces on this thing. But you're beginning. Thailand, who the fuck in Asia? Thailand legalizes and then anti-legalizes, and they don't even know what they're doing there. But the fact that every country is different. Australia, us Americans, who are knowledgeable to some extent, look at Australia, expect you guys to be somewhat progressive, expect you guys with your criminal history and origins to be somewhat caring about freedom. And in fact, it turns out you are more or less public health fascists, excuse the harshness of the term. But you are, right? I will tell you, and here's an analogy here. Are you trying to cut me off? Yeah. Okay.
Socialism, I would say.
Okay,
But anyway,
I'll stop after this.
It's a point of debate.
I'll stop after this. Early in the 2000s, under the second President Bush, our first drug czar back in 1989-90, under the first Bush, was a guy named William Bennett. And he was a right-wing ideologue who really was masterful at playing on the fears of middle-class America around race and their kids, right, in order to put forward a very repressive agenda. Well, the second President Bush appointed a guy named John Walters, who my nickname for him was William Bennett's mini-me. I mean, because he was lower intellect, lower wattage, lower power. But what he spent his entire 7 years as drug czar doing was trying to push for randomless drug testing in the schools without suspicion, and trying to build up a massive drug testing industry in which the major players were a former head of the DEA and a former, Nixon Ford, type drug czar guy, right? They figured if they could squeeze out through universal drug testing, and including in the schools, right? And I worry that, holy shit, they're going to intimidate people from smoking weed with this massive drug testing. And it turned out it didn't work. It didn't work. And now I see, driving into town yesterday with Alex Wodak, and he's getting breath tested and drugged. And you don't actually have rights in Australia. We have a Bill of Rights at least. It still means something in our fucked up country right now, but we still do have this Bill of Rights. You don't have something like that here. But the notion that you could be stopped like this, and that it's based upon legal fictions, as we know with cannabis, it's not even testing like, did you smoke marijuana in the last 2 hours? It's like testing whether there's any metabolites in your system. The bullshit around that, right? So I just keep thinking what needs to happen here? Is it that you have people, really totally legit medical marijuana patients in rural areas, who are basically going into your state legislatures and testifying and pointing out how crazy and ridiculous this is? Is it in fact that you have campaigns pushing for, a new form of drugger licenses where you have a special, marijuana leaf on your license, which you have to take your drug driving test while you're high, and thereby get certified showing that you can drive under the influence of marijuana as well as somebody who's straight, or as well as you are when you're straight? But coming up with innovative ideas, putting together who are the most sympathetic people. In my generation, back in the 90s, early 2000s, it was older people. What moved into Latin America were the mothers living with kids who had that epileptic syndrome, Dravet syndrome, right? And in Mexico and Colombia, nobody got in their way. I'll stop right there.
Thank you. Thank you. In one sense, well, what do you say after that? But in another sense, we can say, look, we have some time for questions. Thank you, Ethan, for that wide-ranging and increasingly passionate contribution to MardiGrass as the talk went on. If you want to ask a question, please do. Put your hand up, though. We need to get the roving mic to you. So put your hand up, please. We've got a microphone so that everybody can hear what your question is. Fill it down the front.
You mentioned that there was a change a couple of weeks ago. I think Trump rescheduled marijuana recently. Is that what you were referring to? And what do you think impact that will have?
Everybody's trying to figure it out.
Also him.
Oh my God. It's beyond a nightmare, as you all know. And I got to tell you, to be an American and believe, I'm a patriotic American. I stood up, and to have this, psychotic nut job in our White House, and the fact that he actually won the popular vote in the last election after doing what he did. Yeah. Anyway, tomorrow, if you come to my talk, I will talk about psychedelics, where some amazing stuff is happening in a very bipartisan way. And I'll also talk about the fact that we've had bipartisan stuff happening on dealing with opioids and dealing with mass incarceration as well. And it's happening on cannabis, although unfortunately the Republican congressional leadership is bad. Unfortunately, the Republicans who happen to be the top half dozen people in our House and Senate are really anti-marijuana types, even though if a bill was allowed to go to the floor, in either the Senate or the House, they would vote to legalize marijuana, right? So the votes are there. We have 80% of the Democrats. We have, 30% or more of the Republicans, but you can't get it through unless you have the Republican leadership. So one thing that's been talked about is the rescheduling of marijuana. We created a system in 1970, the Controlled Substances Act, where we divided it into 4 categories. Schedule 1, those drugs that have no legitimate medical use and that have a high risk of abuse, and then working downward from there. Marijuana, for very political reasons, together with the psychedelics, as well as heroin and some other drugs, got put into Schedule 1. Cocaine and most opioids, from morphine to methadone, whatever, are in Schedule 2, right? Seems crazy. Who do they put in charge of the scheduling process? The DEA, which is the Federal Drug Police Agency and Federal Propaganda Agency on drugs, right? I mean, what their website looked like until recently was a horror. I mean, just straight out of Reefer Madness type stuff. So we were hoping for congressional legislation that would move things. This federal rescheduling process has been going on for a long time. I mean, back in the late 70s, early 80s, NORML got going some action pushing for rescheduling. And finally, in 1987, 88, they have what's called an administrative law judge. And the DEA's own internal administrative law judge, Francis Young, after hearing, reading thousands of pages of testimony and hearing tons of hearings and all this sort of stuff, issued a recommendation saying that marijuana should be rescheduled from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. And he also put in these famous words that marijuana may well be the least dangerous, commonly used psychoactive substance known in human history. This from the DEA's own internal administrative law judge. Well, unfortunately, under federal law, the head of the DEA had the right to say, fuck you to the judge, which is what he did, so it stayed in Schedule 1. So the process has continued. Unfortunately, Joe Biden, among all the Democrats who were tried to ran the primaries in 2019, 2020, he was the least sympathetic to marijuana legalization. He was one of the leading drug warriors in his day in the Senate. Under a lot of pressure, he finally agreed, and finally he pushed Joe Biden to say, let's reschedule from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. We didn't want to go into 2 because 2 could have made things even somewhat worse in certain respects. It could have brought in federal regulators that it could have shut down a lot of the stuff that was already happening. It got stuck. The DEA was blocking it. Biden was no Trump in terms of ordering what's going to happen, whether it's legal or not, which would have been nice for Biden to do. So it dragged over. The health department, our health department, Health and Human Services said, yes, right, we now think it should be moved to Schedule 3. Went back to DEA. They stalled, other shit. Finally, Trump said a few months ago, reschedule Schedule 3. And then the bureaucracy held it up. And then 2 weeks ago, with Trump's numbers falling in the polls and with Joe Rogan, our famous podcaster, slamming him for the war on drugs and all this other crazy shit, but Joe Rogan is totally into psychedelics, Trump's people said, you know what? Maybe it's time to issue a positive thing about psychedelics. So Trump does a press conference with Joe Rogan standing behind him and Robert Kennedy, Jr., who's also sort of pro-psychedelics, and some other people saying, we are now going to make it easier for people to do psychedelics research, and we're going to expedite all these sorts of things. Somebody asked him, what about cannabis, marijuana, as we call it in America? He goes, I know, Trump goes, my bureaucracy's been holding it up. Well, some people in the bureaucracy stood up straight. Meanwhile, the Attorney General from Pam Bondi, who had been the Florida Attorney General, who was a nightmare drug warrior, he had just shoved her out of office, by the way, not because of this issue, but because she wasn't going after former Biden appointees for political reasons, violation of federal law. So he shoves her out for the crassest of reasons, but now her deputy's in place. He'd been in charge of overseeing this area. He heard Trump say, why is my bureaucracy stepping on this? So last week, the Attorney General says, okay, Schedule 3. But by the way, not for all marijuana, only for medical marijuana. What does medical marijuana mean? Well, medical marijuana and regular marijuana is all the same thing. Medical marijuana just means that you happen to have a doctor's recommendation or got it through the medical marijuana allowance system rather than through the adult use one, right? So they've now rescheduled for Schedule 3. Everybody's trying to figure out what that's going to mean. It should mean that marijuana businesses, large and small, will now be able to deduct their business expenses. It'll definitely make it easier to do research, do some other things. On the other hand, they're saying this thing like, hey, now if you have a medical marijuana business legal under state law, well, you can go now get registered with the DEA. And people go, do I really want to get registered with the DEA? That sounds like a bit of a trap. So, you know, and I, by the way, should say, 6 years after I retired, one of the big marijuana companies, probably the best one in America, called Green Thumb, asked me to join their board. So I'm now on the board of a big marijuana company, right? Some of my old friends and allies give me flack for being on the board of a big marijuana company, but I figured 6 years passed since I did this. Okay, I'm going to be on this board. And they don't know if it's good or bad. The big companies, we're all trying to figure it out. The Justice Bar has been told that they now have to come up with a recommendation for all marijuana, not just quote-unquote medical, by September. We'll see if they actually meet that deadline. It's all political. Meanwhile, in the end of last year, Congress passed a law criminalizing the entire hemp industry again within a year. So the question is, come this coming November, will all of this $20 billion hemp industry be now recriminalized? If it is, will anybody actually enforce the law? What will happen there, right? Who the hell knows? Meanwhile, you're still not going to be able to ship this stuff across state borders. So like on the company I'm in, which has dispensaries in 12 states, they have to have a grow facility in every 12 states, and they can't ship it. Meanwhile, you know, my fiance, Krista, and I, we go down to Tennessee last year where they barely have legalized medical marijuana, and we walk across the street into a bar restaurant, and you can get beer, whiskey, wine, you can have dinner, and by the way, here's a display 10 feet across, 10 feet high, of hundreds of THC products, beverages, spray, da-da-da, and you can sit there, drink, have a whiskey, smoke a joint, the whole thing. And it's totally unregulated. They're not paying taxes, or they're just paying low state taxes. They can ship it across state borders. I mean, it is the fucking Wild West. Then we ask the question, in the future, well, you know, when it comes to the flower, the plant, you know, we probably want that just to be real marijuana. We don't want, you know, the hemp stuff that's gotten sprayed with these things, THCA or whatever. But when it comes to gummies and drinks, it's all just THC. So are we going to be moving down the road into a world where, in fact, most beverages and maybe vapes and gummies are essentially going to be THC, maybe from the cannabis plant, maybe not? In the same way with opioids, some come from the opium plant, some are produced synthetically, and when you're a patient, you don't know what even the difference is. If consumers actually cannot tell the difference between a gummy vapor drink done with a hemp-derived THC versus real cannabis, well, will it really make a difference? Now, when it comes to the plant and the smoking, or you know, the heated cannabis stuff, that kind of vape device, maybe it will really make a difference. But we may be moving into a world where that sort of stuff may become part and parcel. So it is an amazing shit show in America right now. It is an exciting, dynamic shit show. And yes, the lobbyists are out there in force with their money trying to get the regs. When we were pushing for the final step of legalization, the reason why New York City became the first place in America, New York State, where you could publicly, most of the places legalizing still made it illegal to smoke a joint in public, right? But in New York, we put it in the law. My successors running Drug Policy Alliance put in the law that you could smoke marijuana in public. Why? Because what the cops have been doing was arresting young men of color, and you could legally possess up to an ounce in your pocket. And so long as it stay in your pocket or your home, you cannot be busted, even going back to 1977 when New York decriminalized marijuana. But the cops would do a little trick, like they'd rough you up. Hey, you, what do you got in your pockets? Can I look in your pockets? Show me your pockets. If you put the stuff out of your pocket and put it like, oh, here, sir, here's what I have, all of a sudden it went from being a low-level infraction to a misdemeanor for which you could have the handcuffs put on. And that bullshit resulted in New York us saying, yes, you can. You can use it in public. Now that's created a problem because a lot of people who are willing to support legalization don't like the smell of marijuana. I mean, it's a little like with gay rights, right? People are saying, okay, what people do in their own private home, private bedroom, cool. just don't start smooching in public. We just can't get used to that right away, you know? Or it's the way people feel about nudity. Hey, like, behind closed doors, do whatever you want. I just don't want my kid looking in your backyard while you and your wife are sunbathing, right? It's the same thing with marijuana plants. I don't want them looking in the backyard at your marijuana plants. So there's a thing about public view and public aroma where people who support legalization and will vote for it don't like the public display, and we have to figure out how to be discreet and not offend too many people around that. So it's a dance, but it looks to me like we're generally headed in the right direction. And of course, America heading in the right direction, Colorado and Washington opened up Uruguay, opened up Canada, opened up psychedelics in America and other parts of the world. You know, when we leapfrogged the Dutch were like, huh, what just happened there? America's leapfrogged us on cannabis, and then other countries began doing it. So I feel good about the fact that we created this paradoxical situation.
Woo. Another question? Really?
Any other, put up your hand.
Comments? No?
Any other questions?
Question at the front.
Oh, okay, just a moment
Just wait for
till
the
we bring
microphone,
the
though. Otherwise,
microphone to you.
no one will
We're
get it.
recording all this for the...
Do you know why Uruguay actually legalized it, though?
I mean, I'm pretty sure I do.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it was interesting.
It's very important.
I mean, there are a number of variables that actually I said one of my colleagues went down to Uruguay and became the leader of the public. She couldn't do the political work. But the interesting was in Uruguay, only 40% of the public supported legalizing cannabis at the point when it happened. And some of the international activists from the transnationalists and otherwise had been down there and been consulting on this sort of stuff and meeting. And there was a wonderful advocacy group called Pro Justicia, I think. I can't remember the name of the ad, but a wonderful advocacy group and smart people in the government. And they met with President Mujica, who's an old Tupamaro guerrilla, leftist guerrilla, but very pragmatic. And they lay it out to him, and his advisors basically say, look, I mean, all the evidence suggests the smartest thing to do from public policy perspective would be to make it legal. But, you know, only 40% of the public supports this stuff, and, you know, we would be... and Mujica goes, you know what? If it's the right thing to do, let's do it. And so Mujica says that, and fortunately, Uruguay has a tradition of very strong party discipline as well. So even though only 40% of the public was supporting it, Mujica and his key people were able to maintain strict party discipline in order to get this. And then they did a research from around the U.S. As I said, they went to Colorado and Washington, said we can't really do that, but they then did a tripartite model. They took a little bit from the Spanish cannabis club model, which is a collective communal model. They took some from a pharmacy type model, and they took some from a kind of grow your own model. And they said, we're going to have these three different approaches, going to be very strictly regulated. They reassured Paraguay. Meanwhile, Paraguay next door is like the leading exporter of cannabis in Latin America, but they're having no conversation about legalization, right? So what would you add to my analysis, or did I get it?
Well, the reason because I'm Uruguayan, the reason was the crime.
Yes. The fact
People was killing their own mothers for ice,
yeah,
to get ice.
yeah,
And Pepe decided to actually legalize marijuana because if you are stoned, you're not going to hurt anybody. You're not going to go and rob anybody.
It's true. I mean,
that was so crime.
The growing crime problem was a part of it.
Nearly 90%.
Well, what's I say? I know enough about what's going on inside from Mujica. I even arranged for Mujica and Soros to meet, and I was at that meeting with them.
And when you say
you know?
about people from there that are educated, they are educated because it's part of our constitution.
Yeah.
Part of our constitution says, let the Orientals, which is Uruguayans, be as brave, because they fought many wars, as educated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it is to say that Uruguay did the right thing, and for that reason, about concerns about crime and a whole host of others. They also wanted to cut down the black market coming in from Paraguay. They wanted to do, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, look, I'm so sorry, but
need to
we've
move-
got to wrap up for the next panel that we're having. And Ethan is here all weekend, so feel free to grab him and
have a
chat
convo.
Personally. And also, Ethan is speaking again tomorrow at
And there's a panel. I'm speaking tomorrow about
and
and this evening with Alex and some others, I think, on a panel about
And
Australia.
that's around 6 tonight in the
6 o'clock,
hall,
6
so
o'clock tonight.
please come back
Okay,
again.
well, thanks for staying. Thanks
Yep.
for listening.
Thank
See you
Once
later.
again, Ethan.